I feel so invested in the faith I inherited from my family, but then at the same time, the Catholic Church is still letting me down.
Today, we are joined by Donna Freitas. Donna is a scholar, a teacher, a writer, and an author of fiction and non-fiction. Today, we will be re-enchanting, losing and seeking faith.
My mother was larger than life, and she was super Catholic, talking to the saints all the time. She was kind of like a fun Catholic. And then my grandma was like her sidekick. My mother would be like, "Are you hungry? Would you like pasta with sauce?" And then my grandma would be like, "We got red sauce, pesto." Like, she'd be like making the list. We had been doing our like phonics lessons at my Catholic elementary school, and literally in the workbook was about Greek gods. I came home that day and I was like, "Did you know that there were Greek gods? Did you know that there were other gods? How do you know we have the right God?" And that was it for me. Like, it was like that day I just lost it. I never stopped questioning it. And it started with my phonics lesson. I was intensely asking all of these questions, and I was searching for meaning in literature. I don't think I realized until I got to college that the search I was doing was also a theological search. And it was my philosophy professors who informed me of that. And I was like, what? And I was like, oh, wow, okay. So I'm still in this.
Yeah, you were still asking the kinds of questions that often lead on to the God question.
After all of this, do you believe in God?
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Re-Enchanting podcast from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle.
And this is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably secular, materialist, disenchanted world with the Christian vision of reality. And we do it with all kinds of interesting guests on all different paths of life and faith.
And today is no exception. We are joined by Donna Freitas. Hello. I'm going to introduce you for anyone who's not familiar with your work yet. So Donna is a scholar, a teacher, a writer, and an author of fiction and non-fiction, both for adults and teenagers. Her most recent book, Wishful Thinking, How I Lost My Faith and Why I Want to Find It, is a spiritual memoir of her Catholic upbringing and adult search for God. And so today we will be re-enchanting, losing and seeking faith.
Welcome, Donna.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Thank you for coming. And we've just had a little chance to walk outside on this beautiful summer's day on the balcony here of Lambeth Palace Library and admire the view of Big Ben and Parliament. Because we're at Lambeth Palace Library, though, our signature question is always, what are you currently reading?
I am currently reading a book that's really beautiful and special, and I've actually been telling everyone I know to read it. So this is perfect. It's called In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. It takes place during World War I. And it's really about boys who went to public school before World War I. And 18-year-old, 19-year-old boys were going off to war. And it was one of those books. I had sort of been in a book lull where I hadn't really loved anything for a while. And I thought to myself, like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not loving any books? And then a friend told me to read this and I picked it up. And you know how sometimes you pick up a book and you're like, oh, this is a book. And so I just really love it to the point where I was almost finished before I got on, before I came here to London. And I realized I didn't want to read it on the plane. Like, I didn't want to finish it on the plane. I didn't want to finish it while I was traveling. So I left it at home, even though that was very hard because I want to finish it in my house in the peaceful morning with my coffee. I have to set up the end.
That is the absolute sign of a good book, is when you plan how you're going to end it and create ceremony around that. I remember I did that once and then someone knocked at my door and ruined it. And I had set up this dream, and I'd done what you did, went on holiday without it, come back, set up this dream, and
it's hard.
I feel like there's kindred spirits here because I've never had this experience myself of planning how I'm going to end a book.
Well, I'm glad I found you then.
Yeah.
Well, because if you love it, like if you just are really in it, you don't want to be on a plane with plane noise and, because then you're not like, I don't know, I wanted peace.
Yeah.
It's a really special book. I wanted to just really take it all in. I wanted it to be quiet. And I read.
This is the sign of someone for whom reading is evidently a really important part of their life. And perhaps that's unsurprising. You are an author. You teach writing. So, yeah, I mean, has that just always been there? That books, immersing yourself in a story and the feeling, the aesthetic pleasure of reading has that always been important?
Yeah, I was raised as a reader. My mother was a big reader. And so it was like, I don't know, it was a big part of my relationship with her. And so I've been a reader my whole life. The kind of reader who got in trouble at the dinner table because I would have my book and I would be told I had to put it away. And I was also getting in trouble for reading in the car because I was going to get car sick. But I would bring my books everywhere. But yeah, I read every day in the morning with my coffee for like an hour.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
it's sort of how I start. It's how I start my day, and then I write. But I always have the reading.
Does it almost? Some people say, if I haven't gone for a run in the morning, I don't feel right. It's almost like I haven't brushed my teeth or something. Is that how reading is for you? It's an important point where you do something to yourself and it sets you up for the day.
Yeah, I feel like I've joked that it tethers me to the earth. Like it's sort of, if I don't do it, I'm going to float away. And it's funny when I was in college, when I was a really intense philosophy major, which maybe we'll mention later, I was really obsessed with this idea that when you really connect with a book or a certain idea in a book, it was like a wormhole in time. And so I was obsessively reading Kierkegaard and Heidegger when I was in college. And so I really had this idea that it was like Kierkegaard and I were reaching out to each other across time. And so I was like one of those people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's intense.
You are speaking my language in so many ways. I'm the type of person where if I'm watching a YouTube clip, I won't skip the advert because I'll think, well, this is 2 minutes I could read. Or like, at Netflix now you can skip the intros to shows. And I'm like, why would I do that? Great. So I do feel like maybe we're kindred spirits. Although I've never loved Kierkegaard that deeply.
I was like 20.
It was a special moment.
But he's good. I like him. I still like him.
Yeah. Okay. We mentioned a book that you have written right there in the bio, Wishful Thinking. We're going to talk a lot about that book. And so the first thing I want to ask you about is two of the main characters in that are your mother and your grandmother. And so I was wondering if you could set the scene by telling us about them, about who they were to you. But also, I would say that another central character, if I can put it that way, is their Catholic faith. So if you could tell us about that as well.
It's funny to hear my mother and grandmother described as main characters. They were both characters. So I thought of them as characters. So my mother she was larger than life, super Italian. Both my mother and my grandmother were Italian, and loud and laughing and cooking constantly. And my mother more so than my grandmother, but my grandmother too, talking to the saints all the time. And like while she's cooking or in the supermarket or anywhere in front of my friends in the car on the way to a dance.
Wow.
So but funny and always try to feed people. And so we always had a lot of food in my house, a lot of cooking happening. And I don't know, my mother was a teacher and was just a lifelong teacher and a beach bum. So and then a beach bum. Yeah, she loved the beach.
Oh, wow.
And then she was super Catholic, but Catholic in a really, I would say, complicated way, but also a fun way. She was kind of like a fun Catholic. She was partly because of all the like talking to the saints and the dinner. Like, we did a lot of celebration with food, and then she taught Sunday school, and she was always, I don't know. She was a funny lady. And then my grandma was like her sidekick. And she was also very funny and making food. It was kind of, my friends used to joke that my mother would be up front when they got to the house. My mother would be like, "Are you hungry? Would you like some like pasta with sauce?" And then my grandma would be like, "We got red sauce, pesto." Like, she'd be like making the list.
Filling in her gaps.
Yeah. So, but my grandma lived with us my whole life.
Yeah.
So she was on the grandma end of the house.
Yeah. And you write so well in the book about those early years and the way that sort of was just infused. There was just sort of absolutely your mum's Catholic faith sort of came through in all kinds of ways, sometimes endearingly, sometimes embarrassingly for you. But that you, whatever, happened with your mum, where it just kind of came to her completely naturally, it just didn't happen for you. Yeah. So tell us about when you noticed that and when I guess people around you started noticing, Donna doesn't seem to be going in the same direction.
She's not talking to the saints.
Yeah.
Yes. Unfortunately, that didn't happen so easily for me. Unfortunately for my mother, I think, and my whole family. But yeah, so faith, my mother was a Catholic school teacher and my mother went to church sometimes daily. She was one of those people. She, had her rosaries she would do. And when I describe her that way, though, I feel like I want to say, but she wasn't like this lady who was like quietly in the church with her rosary. I feel like she was a big presence. She was more like yelling her rosary in the church. She was just very
larger than life kind of character.
like where she was like doing the Christmas pageant and directing all the 4-year-olds and like getting them in a line. So she was like that. But faith was as natural to her as, making tomato sauce and, cooking and making pasta. And for me, I think I was just born tortured. I'm more like my dad in this way.
Okay.
My dad, I learned to call it as an adult. My dad had this darkness. He called it his darkness. And it took me a while to realize that, I was born with my father's darkness.
Right.
And, I think, William James talks about the healthy-minded people of faith, and that was my mother. And I'm definitely like the sick soul or the divided self. So when I was really young, around like 6, I had this conversation with my mother, which I talk about in the book, where I'd come home from school and we had been doing our like phonics lessons at my Catholic elementary school. Where we were reading, the phonics lesson literally in the workbook was about Greek gods. And we were trying to learn to pronounce words. And I was taking it and I was like, what? I was like, what do you mean there are Greek gods? I was like, what is this? And I came home that day and I was like, did you know that there were Greek gods? Did you know that there were other gods? And my mother was folding laundry. I have such visual memory of this. And she was like, what? Yes, sweetheart. Like, there are many other gods. And so she's like trying to talk to me about this. And I was just absolutely horrified that she told me, yes, there, were other gods. And so then I started talking to her about, well, how do you know we have the right God? And she was like, we don't. And she was trying to explain faith to me. And then I was just like, what do you mean we don't know? And then I said, what if we picked the wrong one? And she just kept going back to this idea of faith. And that was it for me. Like, it was like that day I just lost it. And I never stopped questioning it. And I did all the way through up until I became a philosophy major in college. And then I went and I got a PhD. And so but
it kind of started with your mum folding laundry and talking about the Greek gods.
Well, it started with phonics.
Right.
It started with my phonics lesson about the Greek gods. Yeah.
Wow.
So would you say then that, because this is something we don't really talk, or I don't really dwell on that much, but certain personalities are more likely to find faith, hold it, keep hold of it, find it easy. Do you think that's the case?
I do think I know people for whom faith is not a struggle. It's not something, it's not that they don't ever have doubts or that they don't ever struggle, but they don't struggle with the question of God. Faith, that leap that you take about belief in God or faith in God is automatic.
Again.
So, yeah.
And I assume your mother often had struggles of one kind or another, but for whatever reason, God was never in question throughout that. Whereas for you, God was a question mark from the very get-go, really. by the
Yes.
sounds of it.
To my
Yeah.
mother's dismay. We would do things. I remember when I was in college and I was being a philosophy major, a really intense philosophy major, as I mentioned. I remember one time my mom had picked me up from the airport because I'd come back from college to be home for some sort of vacation. And so she knew I was reading and asking lots of questions in my major. And I remember we were like in the car. This is what parents do, they get you in the car and you have captive audience. And I remember we're like driving home from the airport and she was like, "Now, Donna," she had this really intense Rhode Island accent. She was like, "Now, what if God was a woman?" She was like, "What about that?" And then she was like trying to get in there somehow. She's like, "What would that sound? Would that be better? Would that be easier for you?" And I was like, "Mom." Yeah. So
I mean, you write, about the sort of tussle that went on in your household between you and your mum, who obviously you love dearly, but you could also find infuriating at various points. And I guess she was seeing her daughter gradually potentially slip away. I think you did go through confirmation and everything. So you went the route that you were but I think at that point, once you'd kind of done the deed, kind of been confirmed, it was like, okay, now I can I don't have to go to church anymore. I can kind of do. So what was that? How was that tussle as you kind of went through those teenage years and then off to college? Did you feel like your mum was constantly trying to kind of keep you in the fold and you were sort of gradually just finding yourself slipping away from it?
So I think I know this sounds crazy, but I think once I had that moment when I was a kid where I was like, what if we have the wrong God? I really was just like, no, like this is just, we are alone. Like I am alone.
Right.
Like we are alone here. And I really carried that as a teen into my teenage years. And so I had to do all the sacraments because we're very Catholic. And so confirmation, my mother set it up so that, because I was always battling about church. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to go. And so she was like, when you get confirmed, then you're an adult in the church and your faith will be your own and you will decide whether or not to go to church. And I didn't believe her. Like I really didn't believe that she meant it. And so I got confirmed. And then like right after that, I was like, here's the test.
Okay.
Like, Sunday came around and I was just like, I'm not going. And my mother was like, okay. And I mean, I think she was really upset,
Of course.
but she had made that deal with me.
Yeah.
And that at that point, it wasn't hard for me to not go. I was just like, nope, I know what I feel. But at the same time, I think what I didn't realize was I was intensely asking all of these questions and I was searching for meaning in literature. That's
Right.
where all of my questions went. I was like reading all these books. I was reading Ayn Rand. Oh my gosh. I had an Ayn Rand phase. I was really into her. So like I was reading Herman Hesse. I was the usual suspects, turned to Camus. So and so I don't think I realized until I got to college that the search I was doing in literature was also a kind of theological search. And it was my philosophy professors who informed me of that. And I was like, what? So, and I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So I'm still in this.
Yes.
Clearly.
You're kind of invested, but you hadn't quite realized that you were still essentially asking the kinds of questions that often lead on to the God question.
Yeah.
I suppose as that happened, you also write very well in the book about encountering depression, essentially, and this kind of came almost out of nowhere, and you suddenly found yourself just feeling desolate, really, and not really being able to understand why or how that had happened, and again, a cause of great concern for your mother as she kind of was communicating it with you through what, I mean, again, looking back on it now, do you have any kind of words to describe what happened and how did it link in with the search for meaning you were going on through literature and philosophy?
It really did feel like it came out of nowhere. Like one day, this gaping hole opened up. When I was a first year student in Georgetown, and it was just sort of bottomless. And I just didn't, it was like I love to bring up Heidegger when I think about this. He talks about ready to hand and present at hand. And when something is ready to hand, it's working. So, like, you go through a door and the doorknob works and it's ready to hand. But when the door becomes present at hand, you go through the door and the doorknob falls off and you can't get through.
You suddenly notice a thing you've never had to think about before.
Yes. And then you're like, oh, I need to fix the doorknob to get through the door. And so, he talks about how our being can become present at hand, and it's like it breaks down. And then we don't, that's the abyss. And that's despair. That's existential despair. And that's what I was going through. Like, I just kind of couldn't see through the dark to meaning. And then I learned later on that, the dark night of the soul. So, which is sort of the Catholic way of thinking about that, or the wilderness, a lot of people talk about. And, it was just all around me. And I just felt a kind of isolation that I had never felt in my life. And I didn't know how to cross that distance to meaning again, or just sort of being in the world in the way that I was. And for me, it was in my philosophy major when I was reading Sartre and about his bad faith. He talks about bad faith. And I was like, that is what I have. And that's what made me become a philosophy major is I was like, there's a name for what I have, and I need to figure out how to get out of this. Like, how do I get out of here? Because I can't live like this. And I do think, that's why I became a philosophy major. And I think that's what really propelled me onward to studying theology and religion.
I don't know anything about Sartre's bad faith. So can you explain what it is and what you found so resonant within that?
Well, so bad faith, just the most basic way to explain it is, I feel like Sartre uses this example, or my professors use this example. But like, imagine if you're a ballerina and you're a professional ballerina. And so your whole world is dance, and it's how you make your money, but it's your happiness, it's your joy, it's your meaning. And you put everything into dance, when really at any moment it could be over, right? You could lose your leg. You could be in an accident and that would be it. And your whole world, all your meaning would come like tumbling down. And bad faith for Sartre is sort of putting all your eggs in that ballerina basket.
Okay.
And then not being able to function once something happens that takes it away. And so for Sartre and for so many of the existentialists, like, you have to be able to like look straight into the abyss and still say yes. And I think for, a lot of Christians, or, certainly my mother and, Catholics, they would say, you need to look straight into the abyss and realize that God's on the other side. And so I would say the existentialists would say that you just have to accept that nothing's on the other side and still live, move forward. So I really tried to do that in college. I tried to like
sort
live
of
into the
embody
nothingness.
that existentialist philosophy of, even though life is meaningless, even though there's an abyss, I'm just going to kind of try and somehow rise above the meaninglessness.
Or I'm just going to look right into the black and keep going. I do not advise it.
Okay.
Like, it was.
Yeah, it sounds terrifying.
One of the things I think, one of the places where I really sort of got off the existentialist train was this idea that, relationships too are, they're a kind of like facade that we put up in front of the nothingness. And so they're like the ballerina's legs or something, like at any moment we can lose them, which is true, right? And so we shouldn't really define our meaning within those relationships. And I know I got to a point where I was like, wait a minute, yes, they're temporary, or they're contingent, but at the same time, they're my meaning.
Yeah.
And I have to accept that contingency, or that fragility, and that in that fragility, there is also meaning.
When I read that passage in your book, as a Christian, the thing that sort of I thought of, and I don't mean this to sound trite or simplistic, but was that, well, in a way, that when Jesus tells the story of the wise and foolish builder. One builds his house on the rock, one on the sand. It felt to me like he was telling a parable, a story about that idea of what do you build your life on? And you can go, the bad faith route is to build it on something which could be washed away, like a career in ballet or just, a relationship, whatever. All of those things, if you're building your life on that, you can understand that you're building on sand. And he obviously says, so build your life on me, on my teachings. And as I suppose as a Christian, for me, that's a great comfort that there is something you can actually build your life on that is permanent, that won't be washed away. Because Jesus, if it's true, he is who he said he was, then there's a sort of, in his identity, there's this kind of security that you will not find anywhere else. Did any of that register for you at the time, or should Jesus just never kind of in the picture when it came to addressing this abyss and the way in which life is so transitory and often can seem meaningless?
I know this is the thing that I've always wished for.
Yeah.
Like just what you just said about
Right,
it. Like,
yeah.
isn't this reassuring? I'm like, I want it to be. Like, I really want it to be reassuring.
Yeah.
I mean, me and Jesus didn't have much going on in college. So I think there's a way in which, I'm sure there's a lot of Catholics who are going to hear this and disagree with me, but there's at least how I grew up Catholic. It's more like we're talking about God in
Okay.
like big ways. And Jesus
Okay.
is like over here hanging out.
Okay.
And so we were very like God focused. I know about the Trinity and all that. But anyway, let's just put Jesus over here for a second. So, but in theory, yes. And, when I've been in my most, like the absolute bottom of the pit of despair, and I know that's the place, right? That's the place where you're supposed to meet God. In theory, I wrote about in Wishful Thinking about the footprints poem that my mother had on top of the TV framed, my whole life. And, I would sit there sometimes just in utter like isolation and darkness and just be like, okay, God, where are you? Like, now's the time. Like, here I am. Like, come. And, I don't know that I've ever known what it's like to feel that comfort. I mean, I've wished for it. I mean, I guess that's part of where this book, the title from the book came from.
Yeah.
But I will say, sort of going back to like Sartre and the existentialists and the idea that you're not supposed to build your life on these relationships necessarily. It's also true that I built my life on my mother and my father and my grandmother, and they're all gone. And I would never, ever trade those relationships despite all the pain of losing them. Like they are, they are my meaning. And I do feel like it's hard for me to just say I believe in God in the way that so many people find easy to say. But I believe in my mother and my father and my grandmother and the love they had for me. And I believe it is bigger than just what's here.
Yeah.
And for me, that's how I get there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So that's where you part ways with Sartre, because you say, okay, well, even though these relationships are in their most tangible form gone, they're still creating meaning. There's still something solid that I've built my life on.
Yeah.
And I'm still reaping, the fruit of that. So I guess when it comes to like what Justin just said and that teaching of Jesus, does that feel as fragile as a career in ballet? in that, no, I like, is it, because I guess it's hard to say, but this is firm, and you're like, but what if it's not? That's where the faith comes in. What if it's as fragile as a relationship or a career or anything like that? Is that how it feels? Like they're trying to take something out of one category and put it in another?
That's hard to say. I mean, I know it's not supposed to feel that way, but I don't know. I don't know if this makes sense. I've never quite been able to get to God directly. or there's a way in which
Yeah.
I think I've wished for that. Like I've wished for these experiences, like the mystics write about, where they sort of have these incredible connections with God, these sort of like face to faces, with
Yeah.
God, and they feel like they're talking to God. And I've always admired that and just longed for
But you've
it.
never quite been able to have that experience
Yeah.
yourself.
But I feel like I get there, but if you said to me, like, could you get to God via your mother? I would be like, sure. I think
Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah. I mean, you were going on this intellectual journey through college and then as a graduate student. And interestingly, even though you were sort of struggled to make sense of God, to find God, and yet you were kind of sort of, it was always there in the background, as it were. You decided actually to embark on, studying theology of all things, in quite a, full-on Catholic environment. And so I'm just intrigued by the fact that it almost feels like you couldn't sort of shake the God thing or the sort of investigating, if you like, this. And as we'll hear as well, it took you to some dark places personally. But along the way, I think you did discover some of these intriguing characters, medieval mystics like Julian of Norwich and others, who for you gave you, I suppose, a little glimmer of what faith is and how it might make sense for some people, and kind of meant that you didn't kind of give up on the God quest altogether, as far as I can see.
No, obviously I did not. So my mother was completely mystified when I told her I was going to go get a PhD, like theology and religious studies. She was just like, really? And I think she had hope. So she was like, okay, this means something. But I mean, I guess I was steeped in it.
Yes.
And, I was definitely born a questioner. For better and worse. And so I think, and big questions too, like just big questions my whole life, just driving everyone nuts. So my teachers, my parents were really good at indulging them, my father especially. But I was just hungry for understanding, like, why are we here? Like, what is good? I just had these like sort of ethical questions and just big questions about being. And so I just couldn't drop it, I guess. And, I remember I remember two conversations in particular, one as an undergrad and then one right when I got to graduate school when I was at this party. I feel like I wrote about it in the memoir. I was talking to this priest at this party, and both my philosophy professors one day sort of sat me down when I was trying to decide where to go to graduate school, and they were like, all of your questions are religious questions. You'll be happier in a theology department than a philosophy department. And I was like, what? And then I had this really intense conversation about Heidegger with this priest at this like cocktail they had for new graduate students where I went to at a very Catholic university. And we were talking about Heidegger, and he was like, all these questions are religious questions. And I was just like, I know, like apparently they are. And I don't know. I think I've just my whole life been trying to undo that one conversation with my mother when she was folding laundry and we were talking about God. There was a loss there in that moment. And I keep trying to maybe go back to this place where I didn't have that distance, And I think one of the reasons why I always turn to the mystics who talk about the dark night of the soul is they talk about how it's when you're in the dark night that you're closest to God. Like God is right there and you just don't know it. But like, that's when God is closest. And I guess I try to take comfort in that. And I like that idea.
Yeah. It's a bit like, because they draw a lot from Jesus saying like, blessed are the poor in spirit, so that's me. Where's my blessing then? That's really interesting. Whenever I speak to theologians, a classic, obviously theology is the study of God, but also a classic sort of phrase that people say is theology is faith seeking understanding. And it's kind of interesting because in a way it's like with you, theology was like doubt-seeking understanding. Like so it was just, I'd never thought of it that way. But did it feel a little bit like that? Like wanting to make sense of faith, but also wanting to make sense of doubt?
You know, it's funny. I know obviously doubt is a huge part of me. But I don't really think of myself as a doubter
Mm.
in the sense that I believe in a lot of things. I think there are, and I don't have to see them all, you know? Like I believe when I joke about when I talk about writing, like being a writer, that I sound like a true believer. And because writing for me is, I'm so good at taking a leap of faith in so many ways. And I believe so many things about writing. Like I believe it's a miracle. And, you know, I feel like if I've ever experienced grace, I've experienced it when I've been writing, or if I've ever really experienced God, it's been when I'm on the page somehow or when I'm reading. But so I believe in so many things. But it's really hard for me to just say I believe in God.
Yeah.
And so I don't really think of myself as a doubter because I have too much desire and hope. I'm a hopeful person.
Which makes me want to ask whether the God you were sort of trying to find, was it a God that was arguably maybe to some extent made in your mother's image, in the sense that it was her God, the way she encountered it, you thought, well, that must be the way you believe. But I don't know, you were never wired to believe the way your mother did. I just wonder whether you were kind of always chasing after something that was never actually going to be there for Donna.
Figure this out for me, Justin. Please, Belle. I mean, I think that's probably partly true. You know, I definitely grew up with the sort of like old, you know, grandfather in the sky, in the throne kind of God, which didn't make sense to me and still doesn't. And I think some of it is that.
Because what you just described, when you're reading or writing, and the way that in some mysterious way, that's when you're most open to the concept of God, because there's something that is that's transcendent, let's say, about that entering into something. I just feel like that's probably, your mother would probably never have just thought about it like that, but that for you, it feels like that's probably where it most likely you do meet God in some real sense, even though that may not look much like what your mother's experience was, you know, with her talking to saints and, you know, doing the kind of traditional Catholic thing. It just struck me that sometimes we put barriers on ourselves, like it has to happen this way, and that's the way it's going to happen. And it sounds like you've just had a much more winding route round to kind of how you might actually experience God, and it might be quite different to what was modeled for you as a child.
Very winding. You know, I do think so much of my thinking about faith, or even just this conversation we're having, has to do with permission, right? Do we feel permission to name God or the divine in places where we weren't taught to see it or to experience it? Because there's something really audacious about that, or maybe even like you're not supposed to do that. So in a lot of ways, we're talking about permission. And I remember having this conversation last year with 3 ex-pastors. And somehow we got into this conversation about what is prayer. And just it flew out of my mouth that I was like, oh, when I'm writing, I'm definitely praying. And then I was like, wait, is that true? Like it just kind of came out, and because I just thought, oh, if I'm ever praying, it's when I'm writing. Like it is prayer to me. And then I was like, am I allowed to say that? I was like, can you is writing prayer? And you know, it just kind of like started swirling in my head. But as soon as I said it, the question of am I allowed to sort of followed it.
Yeah.
But it made the most sense to me ever, because I don't I'm not a prayer, like, you know, I'm gonna go sit and, you know, kneel like I'm like a good Catholic, you know, on the kneeler in the pews and talk to God. Like, it's just not, I mean, I'll talk to the saints, but that's, because we always need like intermediaries and for Catholic. So I'll do that. But I sort of have this idea of prayer is like you go and you say, "Dear God, blah, 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 blah." But when I'm writing, because I bring all my questions to my writing. Like, I'm a very intense writer. Like, I try to figure everything out in my books. And I am definitely talking to somebody when I'm writing, except I've never been taught to name that God. But a part of me wants to be like, if there's ever a talking to God that I'm doing, that's when it is.
Yeah. That permission is really interesting, actually. And sometimes I think a big thing that I experience a lot and see a lot is permission for questioning as well, and permission. I know you don't think of yourself as a doubter. I sometimes do. So permission to doubt. Like, am I allowed to ask this question or be not sure about this thing? Or so it's a bit of that as well. Maybe did you ever feel like, even when you were, having that conversation with your mum, that you had that conversation and all of a sudden, like, these questions rose within you and there was no permission for them to spill out from yourself? So like, you had to sit them down. So like, it was like a binary thing. If I'm having these questions, then faith can't be present within me. Was there any of that, do you think?
I think there was no quelling my questions. There was no stopping my questions. They were just coming out.
Okay.
And part of the problem is, even though my parents weren't afraid of them, and I mean, I think my mother was maybe shocked and worried about them, about how intense they were. But I think I learned early that they scared people. That my questions were big enough that they were scary, and that, especially growing up Catholic in the 1970s, and early 1980s, I had to take CCD classes, which is like catechism classes, where you learned, you learned about the church more than anything else, about what the church believes, as opposed to, read the Bible, which, when you were talking about the parable, I'm like, oh, here's Justin talking about the Bible. And I'm like,
typical Protestant, going back to the Bible.
But I think I knew very early on that these questions unsettled people. And I was saying things I wasn't supposed to. And it wasn't until I got to college when I sort of met the Jesuits. And they were like, bring them up, bring it on. Like, ask all the questions. And I was really just free to just... be like, I might be an atheist. And, Jesuits would be like, all right, tell me about that. And nobody was afraid.
Right.
And that was really exciting. And I think that's really what allowed me to then get a PhD in religious studies and theology, was because I learned that there were people who were asking these questions, and they were also people of faith, and that you could come from both sides.
There was a real sort of dark side, though, to this journey towards your PhD, which was that you experienced some years of unwanted sexual attention from a Catholic professor / priest. Now, you document all this more in another book you wrote called Consent, but it obviously comes through in this spiritual memoir. And to cut a long story short, this was a very traumatic period for you, but one in which you ultimately felt that the church also really let you down as an institution, that they protected and covered up and sort of looked out for their own, as it were. And you, as someone who was sort of trying to make sense of faith, was suddenly sort of just shut out, in a sense, during this whole process. So it kind of, when I read all that and just the horrible story behind it, it made me feel like, gosh, you had every reason to kind of walk away from church, from these questions, the doubts, whatever, and just say, this is not worth my time and attention. And yet somehow you found yourself still, I don't know, invested still somehow. So, I mean, feel free to say much or little as you want about that period, but what kept you kind of still invested almost in the God question, despite all of that stuff going on around you?
It's funny because we're having this whole conversation, and I feel so invested in what we're talking about, and in just the faith I inherited from my family. And it's such a wonderful part of my childhood and my upbringing. And also just, it's so part of who I am,
Mm.
whether I'm a doubter or questioner, or, I can be like, I believe in God, or it doesn't make me feel twitchy. Like, it's just such a vibrant part of my life. But then at the same time, the Catholic Church is still letting me down. I feel like they'll be letting me down for the rest of my life with this, because they will never apologize to me for what happened. And so I'll just say briefly. So for 3 years in graduate school, I was stalked by my professor, who was also a priest, and it was before the scandal broke. And so I didn't know that this was happening everywhere, and it was really awful. I would say there were parts of the Catholic Church, big C, so like the official Catholic Church, my university, which was part of the official Catholic Church, and still part of the official Catholic Church. I'm still in touch with that university on this issue. And I would say they behaved so badly toward me. It's just shocking to me that they are a religious institution. They continue to behave badly. And at the same time, the Catholic Church is the church of my mother and my grandmother and my father and all the nuns who taught me, and so many wonderful people in my life, and so many wonderful professors I had at that same university.
Yeah.
And also at Georgetown, which was not the university where this happened. I want to be clear about that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was that happened at that time, which is such a strange thing, but it's also true, is that there was the priest who was traumatizing me. And at the same time, one of the people who truly came in and helped get me out of the situation was the priest.
Right.
And he became, like, I think of him as my academic dad.
Yeah.
And, he's just such an influence in who I am today. And so there is a way in which even though there was this one priest, and I know that there was many priests who behaved this way, I also know that there are so many others who don't, or who didn't, and who came to my aid, like along with nuns and other Catholic people. And so it's really complicated.
Yeah. And just a reminder that we live in a very, to use a Christian parlance, fallen world, where you're going to have good and bad within everyone, and you're kind of often at the mercy of an institution which is both beautiful in some respects and awfully corrupt and broken in other respects, all along the way. Another significant moment in the book is the death of your mother. Do you want to just talk us through that period as you came to realize that she had cancer, and the way in which, in a funny way, although that's an awful experience, it was also seeing people come together, the church community especially, that kind of probably gave you the most, it's the point in the book, at least, where I felt you got closest to saying, actually, maybe there is a God, because I feel like this was the practical demonstration that maybe miracles really happen,
Yeah, I wrote a whole chapter about how God is in the lasagna. Yeah.
the meatballs and lasagna that turned up at the door.
So when my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and it was like 4-stage ovarian, which is not good, really sort of a death sentence. And she was a big figure in our church community. And because she was a Sunday school teacher, she was a Catholic school teacher, she was always, organizing the Christmas pageant and like organizing the Christmas caroling and all that stuff. And so it was such a, such a terrible moment. I'd come home from grad school, and, she was going to have this big, horrible surgery. They didn't know if she was going to survive it. And my grandmother was still home. She was still alive, and she had Alzheimer's, and my mother was her primary caretaker. And so it was just, my dad, everybody was just shocked. Like, we were all in shock. My father and I, we thought, well, my mother might die tomorrow. And so, she came through the surgery, and when we got home, there was just, there was literally like a parade of parishioners who just kept coming to our door, like, for days, delivering like lasagnas and all kinds of food, just like showing up without us asking. And And I just remember like just realizing, and her Catholic school community too, the teachers that she worked with and the nuns
and even giving sort of their sick leave and days
Yes.
to her so that she didn't have to lose out on income.
That was the Catholic school teachers at her school. They pooled all their sick days to give them to my mother so she didn't lose her health insurance.
Wow.
And like it was just really extraordinary. You know, and nuns were coming to the house and priests were coming to the house to give my mother daily communion, you know, when she was home for a whole year. And I just remember thinking like, oh, like the church is made of people. And like, this is it. Like, this is like, where else does this happen? You know, like how else does this happen? And so that felt like this extraordinary, I will never forget that moment. And then also related to my mother's death, I remember after she died, and my mother, her and my grandmother died really close together. And I had not gone to mass in a really long time. I mean, I can like recite the mass right now. Like you grew up as a Catholic and it's like you just drone through it like because you just know it.
It's embedded.
Yeah, it's embedded.
Deep.
It's like, it's almost like, you know, when you learn to play the piano, your fingers just kind of remember. It's like
muscle
that.
memory.
And I had gone into this church. I had gone to the mass right near my house in Brooklyn. And I just remember sitting there and just like, and feeling like, oh, this is what my mother was talking about, why the mass was meaningful. Like there was a way in which the mass, because I was so used to going to it with my family, and I would always be sitting with my mother and my grandmother and my father. You know, I was sitting there and I was like, all the words and the prayers, I was just like, oh, my mother and my grandmother are here. And I just remember realizing that was the day where I was like, okay, all this stuff has happened in grad school and I am really mad. Like I'm really mad at the Catholic Church. But this mass, this Catholic mass is bringing back to life, or like I feel my mother and my grandmother here.
Yeah.
And I am so grateful for this. And am I allowed to say hell? Like the hell with these people. Like the hell with these people. Like they're not going to take this faith away from me, because my family gave me this. Like my mother and my grandmother gave me this, and like this is mine, and I'm not giving up the idea that I can come to this mass and be like sit here with my mother and my grandmother. And so I would say her death also brought that.
How do you feel about the church now, I guess is what I'm wondering? And do you still go sometimes, still take part? Do you still feel that like defiance of no, this is a part of me? Or
and do you call yourself a Catholic? I suppose is an interesting.
I do call myself a Catholic. I mean, that feels fraught, but I definitely, I mean, I'm, whether they like it or not, they're stuck with me. And I mean, it's just in my cells, you know, like it's just sort of in my being, and I've just accepted it. I tried like I tried to let it go, and I can't. Because I live in Barcelona, or I'm there so much of the year. I go into churches all the time, and I sit and I don't kneel unless it's in front of a saint. I go into the saint chapels. I light candles for my family all the time. I'm always lighting candles for my mother, my grandmother, and my dad sometimes, and all kinds of people. I'll light a candle for you guys.
I feel jealous of churches where you can just go in and light a candle, because I don't come from a high church tradition, but whenever I take my kids into a cathedral or a church in France or somewhere, there's always an opportunity and the kids love it. They love lighting a candle. You just can't beat lighting a candle. There's something very, very evocative and meaningful about it, isn't it?
I also like the ones where some churches where you drop in the coin and then the candle lights up. You know, it's like an electric candle. Have you ever seen
No,
that?
I've never seen that.
I usually go to the ones, but sometimes you drop in like €1 and it's like the candle lights up.
Wow, the evolution
of
the ritual.
But it's funny, you know, the apartment where I live in Barcelona, one day, about a year ago or a year and a half ago, so I'd already finished this book, but I've I had just recently finished the book, and so this was really swirling in my head all the time. And a friend of mine who's also evangelical, she kept leaving me messages on WhatsApp, and she was just like, "I think you are a believer," and I was like, "Okay." I was like, "Sure, Mindy." Her name's Mindy, and she's always leaving me messages about Jesus. And talking about like signs though, she she would talk about how I feel like signs are everywhere, that that God is there for you. And so one day I walked out of my apartment, and I live in the medieval quarter of Barcelona, and literally right across from my door, it was like out of the wall, suddenly there was a chapel. And it was open. And I mean, I had been there a long time. I had already been living there for a long time. And it's this beautiful chapel. They had been restoring it for like a long time.
Oh.
And they had just opened it up.
Oh, so they'd kind of just taken away the
Like there was a door, but I'd never seen the door
never
open.
really seen it.
It was,
Right.
and
Wow.
if you're in the
Okay.
medieval part of Barcelona, there are these winding streets, and there are these tall stone walls, and there's all kinds of little chapels. And if you look up, there's like saints, up in the streets, like sitting there on the wall.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, these doors magically open and you see things,
Yeah.
But so there's this church that was right there, and there was like a choir singing, and I was like, what is this? And I sort of like went across, and I was like, was this here before? And they were like, no, like, well, it was here, but they were restoring it. And so then I went and I sat down, and there was this beautiful music. And it was right around the anniversary of my mother's death. And I started crying, and I was like, okay, all right. I'm doing this. Like, here I am. Like, this feels like a sign. And so I go there a lot. And, but I don't necessarily just like go to church on Sundays,
Yeah.
I guess, because it feels really traditional and obedient in a way that I don't feel. Yeah.
There's still a teenage rebel somewhere in there.
No, it does feel very obedient in a way that I'm not.
It's interesting because in this season of Re-Enchanting, we're recording most of our episodes sort of in the wake of some really interesting research here in the UK, showing an interesting uptick in religious observance, church going, in an otherwise, generally declining religiosity kind of surveys. There's been this sudden apparent quiet revival is what they're calling it, especially among young people. And interestingly, one of the places where this is happening the most, as it happens, is in the Catholic Church. And I don't know if you've come across this yourself, but lots of stories of kind of young people who maybe didn't really have any association with church, or come from quite secular backgrounds, suddenly kind of discovering something quite interesting and meaningful, and a story, and quite often quite traditional kind of Catholicism as well. I don't know whether you recognize any of that, or the appeal that might be happening in our, as we like to say here, disenchanted culture towards that sort of mystical, quite traditional, quite ancient, way of doing faith. Do you have any idea where that's coming from, and why young people might be suddenly engaging with it more today?
I think it's interesting. I mean, I would say it's because everything about our lives is so fragmented because of, everything online. Even our brains are fragmented. We have such a hard time concentrating. And I think, I think there is a way in which everything is so diffuse now. We were talking about meaning. And I think it's hard to pin down meaning when like TikTok and Instagram and the newspaper, an online newspaper, whatever you read, the New York Times, everything is sort of tugging at you.
Yeah.
Email from a million different directions, and constantly, right? We have no peace.
Yeah.
Like we have no vacation. I remember my mother and my father died 20 years apart, and I learned a lot about like when my mother died, which was about 20, it was going to be 21 years ago. She, there wasn't really email. I mean, there was kind of, but no one was actually checking it. And I could, shut my office door. And if you wanted to get in touch with me, you had to really work for it. Like you had to like write a note and put it under my door. You had to call me and leave me a message on my office phone or something, but you couldn't just access me. And I remember when my father died, it's going to be 3 years at the very end of May. There was no stopping anything. Like my emails just piled up into the hundreds. And I just remember thinking, this is unforgiving. Like, this is unacceptable. Like, there is no way to hold it off. And even you can put an away message, but like, there really is no way to hold off the tide. The world never stops. Like, you can never stop it. And I think that's so, it's so unforgiving. And like, how did we let ourselves get here? And so I think people are looking for a way to navigate that and to find meaning in the middle of this chaos and all these fragments.
We've spoken to someone else with a different journey, but with overlap with yours, called Lamorna Ash in this season as well, who kind of is a more Gen Z young woman who has sort of threw herself into a kind of search for God. What you've just said reminded me of is she, has grown up as a digital native and all of the pressures that brings, but how she found a place of sort of solitude, a quiet for 1 hour a week in a Quaker meeting house where you just had to be silent or wait for the inner light to speak, occasionally. And just the way she described that kind of what it felt like to not have your phone on you and to not kind of be waiting for the next message to come through or whatever, and just having to live with yourself in the silence. And I just wonder whether, in a funny way, people are actually craving that now. It's like church may be the one place where you just stop it all being about you being at the center of this 24-hour, WhatsApp, Twitter news cycle or whatever it is, and you just take a moment at least to focus somewhere else and to have a moment of quiet. Certainly as well in the tradition that you're describing, where you could walk into a church and light a candle. And I can imagine that's quite appealing at this point to a lot of people.
One of the things I love about Barcelona is there are just, you can't turn a corner without a church. I mean, there's like big ones, little ones, there's cathedrals there, but there's tiny chapels. And I mean, there's little tiny chapels, and there's something really comforting to me about that. One is that I feel like my mother is always close because she's just a St. Anthony candle lighting away. Like there's a way in which like she's in every church. Like I actually had a dream. It was after I wrote the book, because I know I wrote about some dreams in the book, but I had this dream that I was flying around in the rafters of a church like an angel. And I was like looking for my mother. Like there was a lot of people sitting on the floor of the church. And I was like, clearly, my mother is like somehow like she's tied up in Catholicism, or she's in all the churches. But I really find comfort in that. And I also find comfort in the fact that there are all of these like dimly lit spaces full of candles. They're very beautiful, like they're magnificent. And you can just go and you can just sit in the dark. And, for me, you can sit in the dark surrounded by the saints, because they're always, all around the edges of the churches, or they're at the front of the church in Barcelona. And I find such peace in that. So, like it's definitely something I do a few times a week.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have one final question for you. And you can take it in any way you want, and you can define every word of it in any way that you like. But I guess after all of this, the most simple question is, do you believe in God? Do you see what I mean? Define every word of that in whatever way you see fit.
Let's see. It's really hard for me to say I believe in God. Like I feel super twitchy. But I think when I sit down to write, I am writing towards something that I cannot see. When I go into a church, like I was just describing, I am, reaching for something I cannot see, and I am reaching beyond the life that we have. Like I am reaching for the dead. And I do believe that I've had these experiences where I've thought to myself, what else is this? What else could this be but God? What else is this but God? But it's really hard for me to just come out and say it. But I think, I don't know, I think that somewhere, even though it's hard for me to say it, I think I live toward that.
Mhm.
So maybe that means yes. Isn't that hard? It's hard for me to say it.
I think in everything you've said, though, you've just given us such a helpful sense in the way in which you've tried with all your every fiber of your being almost to kind of get there, to work this out, to, you know, looking at it from the intellectual side, going through the existential abyss, engaging with it through the faith of your mother, but you know, knowing that you can't simply have what she had. And I found the book just profoundly, well, beautifully written, first of all, but just also not the final word necessarily. I feel like you strike me as someone who's just open to whatever the next thing may be. And, you know, I'm looking forward to a part 2, maybe, to this memoir. Who knows? But it's been really, really fascinating and lovely and very inspiring in all kinds of ways to have you join us to talk about your story. So thank you so much, Donna, for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful to talk to you both. Yeah, this has been such a fun conversation and such a beautiful place. So thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful to have you.
Absolutely. It has been a fun conversation. I hope that you have found it as fun as we have. Thank you for joining us. And also, in so many ways, thank you for making it happen. It happened because of generosity of people like you. So if you want to make more re-enchanting conversations happen, you know where to go. seenandunseen.com/give. But for now, we shall reluctantly say goodbye.
Thanks for being with us, Donna.
Thank you.